One of the most legendary movie monsters, and certainly one of the most influential, is King Kong. If you've seen a giant creature in a movie, chances are they exist because of this massive gorilla. King Kong was the brainchild of Merian C. Cooper, who made a name for himself making documentaries set in exotic locations. One day he had an idea to create a movie about a giant gorilla and set about making that a reality, eventually getting RKO Pictures to release the movie. He then talked to a variety of screenwriters whose contributions would result in the final script about an expedition to an island where Kong is feared by the local villagers. One of the people involved in the expedition, Ann Darrow, is taken by the villagers and sacrificed to Kong, who then takes a fancy to her. However, Anne herself is clearly uninterested. After a rescue mission, Kong is caught by filmmaker Carl Denham, who takes him to New York City, where he's showcased on the stage. He eventually breaks free, kidnaps Anne, and climbs up the Empire State Building. This leads to the most famous and iconic scene in the movie, where airplanes eventually shoot Kong down. This results in the immortal closing line, "It wasn't the airplanes, it was beauty killed the beast." To bring Kong to life, Cooper enlisted the help of Willis O'Brien, who came up with a number of designs before Cooper approved the final version, which depicted Kong as a largely bipedal animal. Skull Island was populated with several other creatures like dinosaurs and Komodo dragons for the humans to react to and for Kong to fight, and it's remarkable what O'Brien's special effects crew was able to accomplish. The effects in King Kong hold up superbly today, so imagine what they must have looked like to audiences in 1933. They conveyed so much character in Kong's expressions and movements, and you start to feel bad for him. He's just this gorilla who's been forcibly taken to a strange place he knows nothing about, so Carl Denham can put on a show and make some extra money. The movie as a whole remains highly entertaining with a really strong story structure and clearly defined characters. Not just Kong, but the three principal human characters of Carl, Anne, and first mate Jack Driscoll as well. There's a reason why the later remakes, even when they change a lot of things, don't depart too heavily from the general structure. What Merian C. Cooper and his co-director Ernest B. Shostak did was truly remarkable, and so many later blockbusters took some influence from King Kong. I think part of the appeal was the endless imagination and how much personality they brought to Kong. He was not merely a movie monster. He was an animal who could be both playful and ferocious, and from the moment he makes his grand entrance, Kong has our attention. And while he does frequently change sizes in each scene, depending on what Cooper wanted him to do, that's not distracting at all, as what he does and how the effects team pulled it off is an impressive bit of movie magic. It's little surprise King Kong would leave such an impact on viewers, including a young Ray Harryhausen, who would later work for Willis O'Brien and become a stop-motion animation legend in his own right. Following the film's success, a sequel was quickly produced titled Son of Kong, and in the late 40s, the same team would come together to make a similar giant gorilla movie with Mighty Joe Young. One of the countries where King Kong had a big impact was Japan. 2 Japanese films based on King Kong were even made in the 30s, although those films are now lost. King Kong also served as one of director Ishiro Honda's influences when he created his own monster movie, Godzilla. For the third Godzilla movie, it was decided to have the radioactive dinosaur fight Kong, and Toho got the rights to make this crossover movie, although Merian C. Cooper was opposed to the idea. Despite being titled King Kong vs. Godzilla, it actually takes a good while for the two of them to meet up. Kong is even asleep through a good amount of the film, and to be honest, I'm not a big fan of his design as he's kind of goofy looking. However, when Godzilla and Kong do finally start fighting each other, it's a pretty fun scene and one of the best moments in the movie. Meanwhile, there's a part where Kong grabs a woman and starts climbing a building, because that worked out so well for him before. King Kong vs. Godzilla was very successful in Japan, with Honda directing another film of the gorilla 5 years later titled King Kong Escapes, which even included a Mecha Kong. Now, something that's affected the use of King Kong for a long time now and has proven quite complicated is who exactly owns the rights. When Cooper produced his 2 Kong movies, he assumed he immediately licensed the character to RKO for those productions and that he owned the rights. However, RKO themselves would license Kong to others, including toy makers, which led Cooper to try to get the release of King Kong vs. Godzilla blocked. But then he considered that maybe RKO really did own the character. Following Cooper's death, Dino De Laurentiis got the rights from RKO to produce a remake of King Kong. However, Universal also wanted to make a King Kong movie. This led to a court battle where Universal argued Kong was in the public domain because the copyrights on novelization, published several months before the release of the original movie, had expired. Cooper's estate was even pulled in, and they argued they owned the rights to the original story. In the end, it was decided that novelization had indeed entered the public domain, meaning anyone could make a King Kong project if it was based directly on that book, and that the Cooper estate also owned the remaining rights outside of the movies. However, after getting those rights, the estate would quickly sell them to Universal, with the exception of publishing rights for things like books and comics. Universal will then shoot themselves in the foot, because a few years later they sued Nintendo by claiming Donkey Kong infringed on that King Kong trademark. The judge then went, "Hold on a minute, you said before that King Kong was in the public domain. Now you're saying he's not," and told Universal that while they owned some rights to Kong, they were not the exclusive rights holders, nor did they have the trademark. I know the whole thing is kind of topsy-turvy, so I hope I explained it as best as I can. But basically, if you want to make a King Kong movie, go right ahead. Just don't use elements exclusive to the movies and other copyrighted material. Although in 3 years, the original King Kong movie and Son of Kong will enter the public domain, and then you can use whatever you want from those. Back to the remake De Laurentiis produced and John Guillemin directed, this movie sought to bring Kong to the 70s. The plot involves an oil company going to the island and finding Kong. This time Kong is mostly played by a man in a suit, who is none other than renowned makeup artist Rick Baker. Meanwhile, Kong was built by Carlo Rambotti, the same effects artist who would later help bring E.T. to life, and he gave Kong a wide range of facial expressions. A fully mechanical Kong was also built, although it was a pain to work with, and does not appear much in the finished film. One aspect included in this remake that would then become commonplace in later Kong media is having the woman, in this case an aspiring actress named Dwan, actually grow to care about Kong. Although there's still a bit of his predatory nature with the way he looks at her, there is a connection formed, and I think their scenes together are some of the strongest in the movie. Instead of the Empire State Building, they had Kong climb the World Trade Center, which had opened only 3 years earlier. It was an inspired choice to have the ending take place there, even if those buildings are now more associated with a tragic real event that happened decades later. I think this remake is flawed, mostly because I don't care about the oil executive storyline, but there are some solid moments in between the wonky pacing. 10 years later, a sequel was made titled King Kong Lives, and this was certainly a bizarre beast. It involves a bunch of scientists who are trying to bring Kong back to life for some reason, and then the Lady Kong is introduced, who he eventually meets and falls in love with. So he seems to have moved on from his infatuation with human women. This is a really silly movie, which might make you think it would at least be entertaining, but I found it monumentally boring. The story is not interesting even when Kong goes on destructive rampages. The people are boring, and even Kong himself is boring, not helped by the film giving him multiple supposed death scenes. There's one scene where even within the logic of these movies, he should not survive, but then he pops up again some moments later. Eventually, Lady Kong gives birth to a son, which could have maybe paved the way for an additional sequel. While King Kong Lives pulled in surprisingly strong numbers in the Soviet Union of all places, the film's disastrous box office performance in America would cause serious financial issues with the Laurentiis Group, and that was the end of their association with the giant gorilla. Despite their embarrassing trial against Nintendo over the character, Universal would still utilize Kong in some ways. One of these included using him as part of their studio tour.
Universal Studios tour, and this time, he wins.
A similar ride with Kong, titled Confrontation, then opened as a day one attraction at Universal Studios Florida. In the mid-90s, Universal asked Peter Jackson if he would be interested in directing a remake of King Kong. Since that was his favorite movie of all time and the reason he became a filmmaker, he had some reservations about whether to do it or not. However, he eventually signed on as a way to pay tribute to a film that was so close to his heart. He and his co-writer Fran Walsh got to work on the screenplay, which had a story more akin to something like Indiana Jones. Quite a lot of work was put into the film, but Universal was worried about competing against the then upcoming Godzilla movie at TriStar and the Mighty Joe Young remake at Disney. So Jackson put Kong aside to then set his sights on a little trilogy you may have heard of called The Lord of the Rings. Having finished that ambitious project to enormous success, he returned to Universal to restart his Kong remake. This included rewriting the initial script to make something more in the spirit of the original, although still some changes here and there. I think Jackson made something that managed to stand alongside the original, expanding the story and particularly the relationship between Kong and Anne. That aspect was actually closer to the 70s movie, with Anne also being an aspiring actress who sees that Kong is more than just a ferocious beast and does eventually care about him. Their scenes together are wonderfully done, which is a credit to Peter Jackson's direction, Naomi Watts' performance as Anne, and the amazing visual effects. Motion capture was utilized for Kong, with Andy Serkis depicting his movements and bringing a lot of personality to the animal. Throughout the movie, we see his protectiveness for Anne grow as he constantly fights the dinosaurs and other dangerous beasts on Skull Island. Jackson taps into his horror film background with those scenes, and you really get a sense of how much Kong has had to survive during his time on the island. While this remake is double the length of the original, I don't mind it too much. Especially since once Kong shows up, the movie excitedly moves from scene to scene as we get a lot of fun action sequences on the island and then later New York. Although the tender and quiet moments are also really nice. The film enhances Kong's jealousy over Jack Driscoll, who's depicted as a writer in this version, and you really sense his anger whenever he catches sight of him. Jackson's passion for the material comes through in every frame of this movie, and he delivers something highly entertaining. After the Universal Studios Hollywood tour burned down in a fire, including the King Kong animatronic, they would even commission Jackson to make a new Kong ride, which became King Kong 360 3D. Years later, a ride titled Skull Island: Reign of Kong would open at Universal Islands of Adventure in Florida, also inspired by Jackson's remake. I've talked about some of the film depictions of Kong, but he's also been seen in animated projects too. The first was a series produced by Rankin Bass in the 60s titled The King Kong Show. With this being aimed at children, Kong is a lot gentler here as he befriends a young boy and his family on the island. He's even taken to New York in the pilot where he causes some commotion, but does not fall off the Empire State Building. He then spends other episodes on the island dealing with the various threats that might harm his new friends and himself. While pitched to a younger crowd and looking like it had an animation budget of $20, there is a sort of cheesy 60s charm to the whole thing that makes it hard to dislike. In the early 2000s, there was a French-produced show titled Kong the Animated Series. This had a particularly crazy storyline where Kong is cloned by a scientist whose grandson gains the ability to merge his consciousness with Kong. Points for originality, I guess, but this is certainly the most unusual piece of King Kong media I've seen. There have also been 2 Kong animated series for Netflix. One was Kong, King of the Apes, a computer animated show produced by Avi Arad, and the other is Skull Island, which is part of Legendary's Monsterverse. In 1998, there was a direct-to-video remake of the original film titled The Mighty Kong. It basically runs through the story in about 70 minutes, although even with that shortened runtime, it still takes a surprisingly long time for Kong to figure into the story. The people behind this basically turned King Kong into a Disney-style musical, even getting the Sherm brothers to write the songs and having Jodie Benson voice Andaro. It's a version of the story that lacks any sort of excitement, and the characters are made uninteresting. And while the film initially makes it seem like it'll follow the ending, Kong actually survives the fall. So this is really more of a curiosity for Kong completists because there's little here that works. Like I just mentioned, Kong is also part of the Monsterverse, although it took a bit of deal-making for that to happen. Legendary was originally going to produce Kong Skull Island for Universal, but wanting to have the gorilla eventually cross over with Godzilla in the movies they were making for Warner Brothers, they made a deal to allow them to take the movie to WB. This movie would place him around the time of the Vietnam War as he comes into contact with some soldiers, although a lot of the film involves him fighting the monsters on Skull Island and developing a connection with a war photographer played by Brie Larson. He's got a thing for blondes, I guess. He would then meet up with his former dinosaur foe in Godzilla vs. Kong, followed by Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. That one is actually my favorite use of him in the Monsterverse so far, as most of it just consists of Kong in the jungle with his son. I really liked how much of their scenes together were dialogueless and relying entirely on visuals to tell the story. A lot of it felt like watching a big-budget Donkey Kong Country movie, although I did not mind the human storyline in Godzilla x Kong either, as it was essentially Journey to the Center of the Earth with a fun Dan Stevens performance. Of course, because of him being somewhat in the public domain, King Kong has been in several other media beyond those I mentioned, like books, comic books, and even a stage musical which premiered in Melbourne, Australia, before playing on Broadway for a little while. A few years ago it was announced that a new live-action series was being developed for Disney+, which would go into Kong's origin story. However, there have not been any updates since that initial news, so I don't know what the current status is. But as you can see, King Kong has had quite the impact since he first appeared on movie screens, and with that gorilla continuing to thrive in the Monsterverse and in other material, the 8th wonder of the world will be around for a while, whether he's fighting off airplanes or fending himself from other giant creatures. See you next time.